Now, how do you do team science? So as I said, in the 2000s, we really started to see people paying serious attention to this issue of scientific collaboration. Jonathan Cummings and Sarah Kiesler were some of the original people studying things like NSF centers, and they noted that we continually are seeing struggles and challenges from this kind of teamwork. As I mentioned, you have the problem of terminology remaining parochial, the methods of practice are disconnected, you have the departmental silos are still prevalent. But the point we've been making is that these boundaries need to be crossed, and we need to ensure that the knowledge within these disciplines are being shared with each other so that we can create the kind of integrated problem-solving team that I mentioned is necessary for interdisciplinary science. And the issue is that the interdisciplinary nature of science teams means that we need to understand how to train and measure teamwork in science. So what do we mean by teamwork in science? How do we facilitate teamwork in science? And how do we measure teamwork in science is what I want to talk about next. And this is what we've been arguing, is we can apply the science of teams, that is the study of teams in other settings, to team science. So we can draw from a large body of research in the social sciences, and we as scholars in the study of teams need to figure out how we can better understand and improve collaboration in science. So the goals here that I'm going to go through are trying to understand leadership's role in science teams, try to understand the particular competencies that are necessary to work in a science team, how can we take those competencies and train them for science teams, and how can we assess these competencies, and how can we measure processes and outcomes in science teams. So now, team leadership. So this is a huge area in the organizational and social sciences. Some have argued it's one of the most critical factors leading to success in organizational teams. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, John. How leaders in science teams achieve their goals is very similar to what we see with regard to leadership in organizations, and that they try to enable maintenance and growth of teams and the team members. And what leaders will do is promote coordination and adaptive team performance. And this is something that has been studied for decades. And here's a quote from one of the leading social scientists in this area. Leaders provide a means to do or get done whatever is not being adequately handled by the group. So it's a leader's responsibility, the buck stops here kind of thing, that if something's not happening, the leader needs to step in and ensure that goals are being met, objectives are being met, etc. No? Okay. So there's been lots of studies of leadership, and I want to make a distinction between some of the things that leaders do. So leaders can take a task-focused or a person-focused perspective, and a meta-analysis on some of this research showed that task-focused leaders explain 12% of the variance in performance outcomes, developmental leaders explain 10% of the variance, but the most interesting issue is that the degree of interdependence in those teams mattered. So leadership behavior explained almost 20% of the variance in highly interdependent teams. So teams that really needed to be coordinated well, that is where they had the specialized knowledge that need to be shared among members to produce this objective or goal, that accounted for a significant amount of the variance, or leader behavior accounted for a significant amount of the variance. So the point I wanted to make for your center is to ensure that the teams being formed understand the nature of the interdependencies. Given the variety of projects that you're funding, I suspect that there's going to be variability in the amount of interdependence. Some are going to have to meet fairly regularly, some are going to have to coordinate a lot, and others may not have that level of coordination or independence, and therefore that's going to influence what the leader needs to do in those kinds of situations. Just quickly, what do team leaders do? Well, they can, as I mentioned, they can promote task performance, but they can also promote learning or development. So from the task standpoint, they can do things like foster interdependence, but from the learning standpoint, they can do things like explain the rationale for the decisions. So I'm sure you've been in projects where you have a leader who just says, do it, don't ask me why, or you've been in a situation with a leader who says, this is what we're going to do, and this is why we're going to do that. So they're doing that from a developmental standpoint. They want the team to understand why something is taking place, why actions are being engaged, and that's an important developmental process that will promote learning in the team environment. And I recommend that when you think about the kinds of teams that you're putting together, that the leaders understand the difference between promoting task behaviors and promoting learning within those teams, It's particularly important in science teams because you've got students involved there. And the whole purpose of involving students is not to get cheap labor, it's to educate the next generation of scientists. And this is a fundamental issue that I think that science leaders need to recognize. You are there to teach them. They are not there to do your work. And this is a significant issue that I think if you can cultivate that kind of culture in your science teams, you're going to do a service to sustainability studies. Now I want to move to a specific theory of leadership that's one of my favorites because I see it as most relevant to team problem solving in science. And this is a functional approach to leadership that Steve Zuccaro has promoted over the years. And what Steve has argued is that leadership is a kind of social problem solving. So what the functional leadership theory emphasizes is this idea as leadership as a boundary role linking teams to their environment. And what they mean is that leaders have to interpret events that take place in that environment, and they need to adjust how the team responds to those things in the environment based upon how they think they need to modify their attitudes, how they need to motivate them to deal with these problems that are emerging, what kind of knowledge do they need to impart on their team to deal with these environmental problems. So this notion of social problem solving means that the leader needs to see what's happening, see what are the barriers to performance for that team, and then modulate that team performance based upon their assessment of how they need to resolve those problems or overcome those barriers. So what Zuccaro has talked about is how leaders can influence the affective or attitudinal processes. So for example, leaders can influence motivational processes within a team, so they can predict particular motivation strategies for that team that's going to influence their behavior. So they may say that, well, if we get this project done in a week, then I'm going to reward you all with X. Simple example, but that's the way a leader can impart motivational changes. Or I'll fund all of your trip to this conference if we get this paper out the door and submit it, something like that. But they can also indirectly impact motivational processes through things like personnel development or feedbacks or influence them through planning. So I mentioned the example of the team learning their developmental aspect. If you're working for a director of a project who is very good at the team learning, who will sit down and take a half hour of their precious time and say, well, let me explain to you the background of this project and what got us to this point today and why we're doing what you're doing. You, as a junior scientist, are going to appreciate that, and that's going to motivate you to work harder. So that's how a leader can indirectly motivate members of a team. An important thing that leaders can do is also set the norms and the climate within a team, so they can foster this idea of openness. So some of the leaders that I admire in science teams will say, shut up, co-PI, I want to hear what the graduate students have to say. You know, what do they think about this issue? I know what you think, I want to hear what they have to think. So they're fostering this culture of openness where anyone can speak out and contribute to the dialogue. And another important element is this notion of conflict within teams. There's many different forms of conflict that can emerge. So the simplest distinction is what I call cognitive or intellectual conflict in team science, or affective or interpersonal conflict in team science. Cognitive is we disagree because of the problem and the approach that a particular method is being adopted or suggested by one member of a discipline. Interpersonal conflict is you disagree because you don't know anything about this problem and I think you're a jerk. So we want the intellectual or cognitive conflict where I, as an experimental psychologist, might go in there and say, well, if we really want to understand this, this is the procedure that we should implement. And then an anthropologist or an methodologist might say, no, we can't do an experiment to do this. You're just going to dumb down and have a reductionist kind of control setting where you're really not going to understand the phenomena as it really emerges in that environment. So that kind of conflict is more productive because we're going to understand each other's perspective on how to explore a phenomena, as opposed to you don't know what you're talking about, I don't want to interact with you at all. So there are other forms of conflict that might arise. Logistical conflict, for example, is something that you might see. You mentioned a lot the cyber infrastructure that you all support. So logistical conflict has to do with the disconnects that arise from people who are trying to interact over time and space. And that's another form of conflict that leaders need to manage. So the point here is that it's the leader's responsibility to identify what are the different kinds of conflict that are emerging, because that's going to determine the solution that is going to be implemented to overcome that conflict. And you want to kind of foster the kind of cognitive conflict that's going to lead to productive interdisciplinary outcomes where you come to a consensus or you come to a mutually beneficial solution. You want to dampen or inhibit the interpersonal conflict by trying to manage that interaction. You need to put resources in place to overcome the logistical conflict. So these are all the kinds of things that team leaders in science need to address. So with regard to the behavior, again, this idea of developing a team's awareness comes in. It's the leader's responsibility to help the team see the big picture. Because sometimes some of the scientists, the graduate students, they're so embedded in the particular problem that they're not going to be able to see the big picture. And the leader can influence these kinds of behaviors and increase the team's awareness. And they can tell them, well, this is what's going on, and we're going to need to solve this problem by moving these resources around. I mentioned this idea of developmental and goal-oriented feedback that can influence behavior. They can offer clear task strategies. And again, this notion of social problem solving means that they influence behavior by monitoring environmental changes. And then finally, leaders influence cognition by informing or instilling understanding of the team's objectives and goals for the problem, and helping the team understand each person's contribution to the problem. So for example, a team leader might say, well, we really need to hear from the neuroscientists in order to solve this problem. Or so then in my case, we really need to hear from the computer scientists to come up with the right model to represent this problem that we're trying to solve. So what a team leader will do is instill the understanding by pulling out the knowledge from the different disciplines and put it all on the table so that everyone can understand the perspectives of the members of the scientific team. So the point that I wanted to make for your center is that this functional theory of leadership is something that I see as really helping science team members understand how leaders can influence attitudes, behavior, and cognition within the team. Next thing I wanted to point out is a method from the organizational sciences called a training needs analysis. So this is something that we've seen arise where organizations want to improve their process, improve their outputs, and they say we need to do a better job training our people. So what has been identified is this notion of a training needs analysis where you look at the needs at multiple levels so you can better understand what specifically is the problem you're trying to solve through training. So they've broken it down to this notion of organizational, task level, team level, and individual level. So at the organizational level, what they try to identify is where and when the training is needed and to what degree the institution supports the training implementation. I can't tell you how important this is. It doesn't matter how good your training program is. If it doesn't have the support of leadership, that is that no one's going to be encouraged to do the training, or they're not going to let people take the time off to do the training, it's going to fail. So you want to make sure that the leaders have buy-in. And I see this as particularly important to science teams, and I'll talk about that in a second. Another important element, though, is the task level, where you have to try to identify what specifically needs to be trained. So what is the content that must be mastered so the team will be successful? So you need to look at the problem that a team is trying to address and figure out what do they need to be trained at the task level so that they can work effectively. The next level is that of the team, where this notion of interdependencies comes in. So you want to identify what are the interdependencies within that team and the competencies that are going to influence the roles that these team members must fill. And then at the individual level, what you try to look at is who within the team needs to be trained, and whether you might need something like individual training or team process training. So individual training is, well, your skills in statistical analysis are a little low. I want you to beef that up a little bit and brush up your understanding of statistical methods. Or you might say, well, we need this some better process training. You're not very good at communication skills. Why don't you get some training to inform you on how to better talk to people from other disciplines. In thinking about this training needs analysis and the kinds of things that you're trying to address here, it's something that you may want to consider when you are developing these kinds of projects. So I mentioned this issue of, do people value training for team science? I bring that up because I think some people don't really understand or appreciate the social science of teams. So if you go in there and you try and tell scientists, here, we're going to help you do your job better, they're going to be like, get out of here, I'm fine. I've got 3 Nobel Awards, I know what to do. So this is a significant issue when it comes to this kind of organizational level. Is the training even valued? And another thing you should think about is where should the training take place? Are you going to bring everybody to your center and train them on certain things, or are you going to develop classroom modules that can be uplinks so they can do it online? So these are the kinds of things, and listening to and seeing what you're trying to accomplish, you need to kind of resolve. So what training is better accomplished at the center, or what training can be accomplished through something like an online learning module. And I think this directly impacts the task level training. So do the succinct teams know what they need to know? So what shared theory, concept, methods, and tools need to be trained? And this is important because I've been thinking a lot about this issue when it comes to interdisciplinary teamwork. What can we do to train members who come from different disciplines? And one idea that I've been speculating is companies like Coursera and all of these ones that are making available courses for free online. I'm wondering, well, if I'm on an interdisciplinary team, or if I'm leading an interdisciplinary team where psychologists and neuroscientists and computer scientists and engineers all need to work on a particular project, those are the kinds of teams that I operate in, do we say, okay, you all need a basic understanding of X. Coursera or MIT has a free course in X. I want you to spend a month, 2 months prior to us getting together to take that course so you at least have some foundation of understanding, for example, for computer science or for neuroscience, the things that are outside my area. Should I be taking courses that are available for free as opposed to you all developing the courses themselves? So I'm kind of excited with this change that's been happening with online education, where major universities are putting their courses out there for free. Is this something that can help us solve the interdisciplinary science problem? Because you can just say, go take these courses and get brushed up on these other disciplines with which you're going to be working. With regard to the team level, this issue of interdependencies from the standpoint of who needs to do what and does everyone understand their roles is something that you need to identify. So does the succinct team members understand the form of interdependence within the team and across teams? So do they know what roles need to be filled and who needs to be doing what? And then last, the individual level. Do the teams know which members need more or less training and in what kind of training? So for example, graduate students may need a particular form of training versus postdocs versus scientists. So when you do these training needs analysis, you not only need to identify what should be trained, but who within the team should get a particular form of training. So this was just a simple example of how an organization like this could take what we know from business schools and from industrial organizational psychology and think about how it can improve collaboration in science for your center. Now, I think I'm going to go through this quickly in the interest of time, because I'd like to have some discussion. One particularly relevant theoretical construct to team science that I've been promoting is this notion of team and task competencies. So Jan Cannon-Bowers and her colleagues came up with this framework back in the 90s where they tried to classify what are the competencies necessary for effective teamwork, and they broke it down into specific and generic competencies. So they talked about team generic and team specific and task generic and task specific competencies. So the generic ones, are the team generic competencies, are the things that are necessary regardless of the context or the setting. The specific ones are the competencies that are directly needed for a particular team in which one is working. The task generic competencies are something that you can take with you no matter what task you're working on. Task specific are the ones that are associated with a particular task that you're trying to address. So with that kind of taxonomy, you come up with this nice little 2x2 matrix of the specific competencies and the generic competencies that are necessary to be trained. So something that is specific to the team and the task, we label that context-driven. So the knowledge is something like the team's objectives and the resources. The skills are the particular types of analyses that need to be done. So is it something like a big data type of project so that you really need to understand? The attitudes might be something like collective efficacy. Do we really have the requisite set of competencies within this team to solve this problem? And then the opposite of that is what are referred to as transportable team and task skills. So this is knowledge. So understanding group dynamics. Doesn't matter what team you're working in. If you really know some of the problems that can emerge when people get together, that's going to be useful in any team context. The skills, so communication and assertiveness. Again, doesn't matter what team you're working on. If you know how to stand up and express your opinion forcefully without being rude, that's a good skill. And attitudes, so something like interdisciplinary appreciation. You're going to be able to take that to any team you work with, no matter what. So do you understand the value of working with team members who are from different disciplines? So again, I think this is a useful way to conceptualize the different forms of competencies that are necessary for effective science collaboration. So I wanted to put it on the table. And I've been thinking a lot about these transportable skills, and my colleagues and I have thought about this in the context of interpersonal skills. And this is basically, how do you teach people to engage in teamwork in an effective way, regardless of the team context? So these kinds of things that I just mentioned about assertive communication. So there has been some research in psychology on interpersonal skills, and I'll quickly go through some of these things. Again, these are the kinds of competencies that you can take with you no matter what. And I think these are targets for science teams, because the way I've been conceptualizing this is this something we need to start teaching in undergraduate and graduate school? That is the kinds of interpersonal skills that they're going to be able to take with them when they're done, or take with them on any project in which they may be working. So what the psychological and organizational sciences have identified are these major categories of interpersonal competencies, the ones that I call transportable. So from the standpoint of communication, this includes active listening, oral and written communication, and assertive communication. So active listening, I can't stress the importance of this one from the standpoint of interdisciplinary science enough. Whenever I'm on an interdisciplinary science team, particularly in the early stages, and you just sit there and listen, you can tell who doesn't understand what another person is saying. You can see it in their body language, you can see it in the way they're describing or responding to a statement that someone has made. It becomes very apparent when there's this disconnect, when there's non-overlapping knowledge within a team. And I refer to this as listening to, carefully attending to what is said, and you need to, if you understand that someone doesn't see what another person's perspective is, you need to have them explain what is meant. You need to request that the ambiguous ideas or statements are repeated. So for your center, I think that this competency needs to target listening to learn and understand, and listening to contribute and integrate for problem solving. So an example that I had was in a project with computer scientists and engineers where we were working on robotics. And the term interface kept getting used. You know, there's a problem with the interface, and there's an interface issue. And we're going through, and we have lots of time spent on this interface issue. And then it occurred to me that some people saw interface the way human-computer interaction researchers think about interface. You know, what's the display? How does the person read that display, and how do they interact with the information on the computer? But the real problem that the engineers were talking about and the computer scientists were talking about was interface is the term used to describe how different forms of software talk to each other. So it had nothing to do with the human-computer interaction problem of interface. It had to do with the way the technology was communicating with each other. So I wouldn't have picked up on that had I not been listening to what people were saying to each other. So it's these kinds of things that I think are particularly important when it comes to interdisciplinary science. It's important because it's incredibly hard just to do interdisciplinary science in the first place, let alone making sure that everybody understands each other. With regard to assertive communication, I mentioned this one earlier, and this is also important. So you need to not only not be afraid to propose your ideas, but you also need to defend your ideas. I don't know the culture of the teams with which you operate. I just know the cultures of the teams with which I operate. This is a hard problem. As a social scientist working with people in the life and medical sciences or the physical sciences, again, there's this issue where sometimes the methods or ideas are not always respected. So you need to not be afraid to assert your ideas. There's this idea of what we'll call relationship management competencies. So the skill has to do with coordination. So I mentioned this idea of understanding how to work with others as a team, being mindful of the interdependencies within that team. Do I know who needs to do something at a particular point in time? Also offering help and backup as needed. So this would target, in your case, understanding the importance of awareness of shared scientific goals and the importance of monitoring and feedback within those teams. So do you know that the team knows what they're supposed to accomplish? Do they have a shared or common ground associated with the problem that they're trying to address? And are they able to monitor and provide feedback? And the challenge you all are facing is a lot of the work that you're supporting is distributed in nature. So that introduces the importance of the cyber infrastructure to ensure that people can be monitoring and feedback. It's one thing when you're all co-located, it's a completely different thing when you're separated. So that's where the tools and the technologies that facilitate collaboration are going to be particularly important, because they also need to support the ability to monitor and provide feedback. Another one, I call it interdisciplinary appreciation. It actually originally had to do with more cultural appreciation, because organizations and the organization sciences, what they started to address was cultural diversity. When you started to see businesses operate internationally, that they needed to make sure that their employees had international awareness and international appreciation. In science teams, I call this interdisciplinary appreciation. So do they appreciate the different disciplinary theories and concepts? Do they respect the varied disciplinary methods? And do they encourage input from across the disciplinary perspectives? So in this case, the competency would target acceptance of and an openness to new ideas and sensitivity to disciplinary perspectives. Again, I really am unfamiliar with the cultures in which you operate and whether or not this is a problem. I just know I've seen this in other disciplinary interactions, and this is something that we see come up a lot in the science of team science. And actually, did I send you the newsletter for the in-group organization? I just wrote about this in the organization, the Interdisciplinary Network for Group Research, where I talked about some of these different attitudinal, behavioral, and cognitive issues. So I'll send that to you. And then finally, the need for collaborative orientation. So this is where you look at people's predisposition to certain interaction capabilities. So do they have a predisposition to provide help to others? Do they have intellectual curiosity in service of understanding others? And can they build rapport with others? So in your case, this is targets the ability to elicit ideas for the purpose of understanding and to offer solutions in support of problem solving. And so this is where you need to make sure that people can pull the knowledge from the different disciplines in order to support the problem solving. So if I'm on a team and I say, well, we really need to hear from so-and-so because they have the expertise that I don't have and they've just been sitting there quietly. So do they have that kind of collaborative orientation where they're not afraid to do that? And this one I think is particularly challenging. So the hard part of interdisciplinary research is the breadth versus depth problem. So the jack of all trades, the master of none. Sometimes you need the people who are the master. That is someone who has only done psychology research their entire life, but by God, they're the best researcher out there on this topic. When you find people like that, though, what you often find is that they really don't care what someone from a different discipline has to say. So in my own field, I know psychologists that are brilliant in what they do, and when I try to get them to work with a computer scientist, they're like, why? You know, why would I want to do that? I don't care what they have to say. So there's this challenge of a lack of intellectual curiosity. They're not interested in what people from different disciplines might say about the particular problem that they both are trying to solve. So computer scientists, they try to solve the problem of teamwork all the time. They're building these collaborative infrastructures that will facilitate distributed interaction. And they're trying to understand teamwork from their own disciplinary perspective. And I think that they have a lot to contribute to our understanding of collaboration, but my colleagues in certain disciplines who study teams don't invite them to the table, so to speak. So I see this as an issue of intellectual curiosity. And again, your center, I don't think, has that problem as much because it's a self-selection issue. You're inviting people who are more intellectually curious.